As a deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you, my God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. Where can I go and meet with God? My tears have been my food day and night, while people say to me all day long, where is your God? These things I remember as I pour out my soul. I remember how I used to go to the house of God under the protection of the Mighty One with shouts of joy and praise among the festive throng. Why, my soul, are you downcast? Why so disturbed within me? Put your hope in God, for I will yet praise him, my Saviour and my God. My soul is downcast within me, therefore I will remember you. From the land of the Jordan, the heights of Hermon, from Mount Mizar, deep calls to deep in the roar of your waterfalls. All your waves and breakers have swept over me. By day the Lord directs his love, at night his song is with me, a prayer to the God of my life. I say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why must I go about mourning, oppressed by the enemy? My bones suffer mortal agony as my foes taunt me, saying to me all day long, where is your God? Why, my soul, are you downcast? Why so disturbed within me? Put your hope in God, for I will yet praise him, my Saviour and my God. Well, thank you so much. I wondered beforehand why you might be here, and I wondered if part of it was connection. Connection in different ways. Connection with other people, which there's something about coming together with other people. If it was just two of us in the room, it might be less enjoyable, but there's something about gathering with other people, and there's also a need for us to reconnect with God, and I think a lot of your words, I'll read them in more detail as I take them away and mull on them, but I think there's a deep desire in us to be connected with God in a new way. My brother does this on the beach. Does your brother do that, or is he the only one? He's a unique man in some ways, I think, and he spends his whole holiday ignoring the rest of the world, trying to balance stones on top of each other. It's a beautiful thing, though, and he takes pictures of them. This isn't one of his, but they're remarkable things, aren't they? He prefers the ones where it looks impossible, or it looks like they only stood still for a moment. He likes those ones. But I think some of you are coming here because of the word rhythm, and there's something about your life being out of balance, and you long for your life to have more balance. Anyone in the room? And then, do you know these guys from the repair shop? Do you watch that program? Anyone over 50? This is what we do with our lives. But what I love about this program, and it's one of those programs that I could watch back to back and be drawn into, is the flow. Flow is one of the words that Tori has taught me, because as an occupational therapist, one of the things that she's interested in is what motivates people, what keeps them going, what gets them active, because occupation is so vital for us. And we know that feeling. Do you know that feeling of being in flow? There's a guy who's written a book about flow. He called it Flow. And you can ask Tori about it. And it's all about that feeling you get when you're lost in it. When your mind is off, you're so in flow that you can't remember time, that it's as if everything stops and you're in your own world, and it's pure joy, isn't it? It's not effortless. It could be incredibly intense, but you're in flow. And I wonder whether that's another reason that some of us may have come to this building on a increasingly cold autumn series, that we come because we're looking for that moment. We've had that moment before when it felt like our Christian faith brought us to a point of flow where we felt like everything connected. But maybe we've lost a bit of that, and we want to regain that sense. Anyone in the room feel like that? Yeah, thank you for your honesty, the two of you that put your hand up. So the goal of the sessions is to increase, I would say, I'm hoping that the purpose of putting these sessions together is that we might increase together, individually and also together, in our flow, our power, our purpose, our usefulness, and therefore our joy. For I think all of these things lead to joy. When we feel like we're in flow and we have some power that we can use and we have some purpose and direction and we feel useful, and then isn't that the moment when we feel alive? So that's my hope. And I was, while I was at New Wine, I was listening to a guy called Jordan Seng. And he talked about the power of Jesus. And he came up with this thing called the power equation, which he said, I don't really like the word because it sounds like there's a kind of mathematical, and it sounds a bit wrong. He didn't like it, but I liked the fact he didn't like it, but he stuck with it anyway. He said, in other words, the power of Jesus seemed to be effective for a number of different ways, and it kind of came through him. And there were times when it seemed to be like particularly able to flow. So I've switched it to the flow equation. And it's in his book. You can read it in The Miracle Work. And he says flow or power is a mixture of four things: authority, faith, gifting, and consecration. Authority, if you are in your authority, under authority, you've got authority for something, you have more power available to you. If you have faith and confidence in what you're doing, or if you have faith in God, then there's an incredible ability. More faith, the better the flow, the more the power. And then if you're using your gifting, the thing that makes you you, as opposed to doing the thing that's not you. You know that feeling of when you're doing something because you have to. You've got the authority to do it, and you've got faith to do it, but it's not your gifting. It's not as good, is it? But when you have your gifting and you're using that, it's even better. And then the last one he said was consecration, where it's the amount to which you give yourself away to something, or you sacrifice yourself. So that the people who achieve most in life are those who are most conscientious, those who give themselves away, who sacrifice things for the cause, for whatever it is that they're doing. And so he said all of these things make you more powerful. And so I wrote that down, and I thought that was really good. And I wondered if that's why we're gathering, so that we might increase in our purpose, in our potential, in our impact. And how might we do that? Well, we might grow some of these things. And so the idea of looking at sacred rhythms is that these things, these disciplines, might help us to become more effective. They're not things that we do because we want to impress anyone, or that we want to do a Christian thing, or that we want to look like we're slightly better than anyone else in a kind of hierarchy of goodness. Or we certainly don't want to impress God with our fasting or our silence or our community or our giving or our service, but rather we want to do something so that it makes us better people. Would you agree? So that we can actually feel like we're more alive, which would be a good thing, I think. So I've called it Sacred Rhythms because I've nicked the title from a beautiful book, and we owe Ruth Haley Barton a lot, or rather I do, because she's really helped me in my spiritual life, in my growth, and I read everything that she writes, and I also listen to her podcasts. So I recommend that you listen to Ruth Haley Barton, and the book that she's written, which I nicked the titles from for a lot of the weeks, is called Sacred Rhythms, and the title is Arranging Our Lives for Spiritual Foundations. So you know where I got it from. Yeah, so we thank you, Ruth Haley Barton. But here is a little picture of what the journey we might be on. And of course, the goal is to get to Jesus, the North Star of our lives. So we want to point to him. We want to be the window that people look through us as a church and individually, through us towards Jesus, that we point to Jesus. So what kind of shape might we have? Well, here are some of the things that we're going to cover. We're going to look at solitude. We're going to look at community. These are the two foundational spiritual disciplines. And then we're going to look at Scripture. We're going to have a week on self-examination, which doesn't sound so good sometimes. It sounds a bit medical. It's not going to, it's not, um, yeah, you're a bit worried about that week. But that's going to be a great week where we're going to just think about the power of looking inside ourselves and knowing ourselves. So therefore knowing God. We're going to look at Sabbath. And then the last two, prayer. We've got a guy called Pete Gregg. Anyone heard of Pete Gregg? I couldn't get him, so... No, actually we have. We've got Pete Gregg. We've got Pete Gregg coming. And hopefully he's going to speak on prayer. Although, being Pete Gregg, he'll probably speak on what he wants to speak on, and we'll just be grateful for that. And then the last one is putting it all together under the title, A Rule of Life, which is just trying to make sense of all of the things that we've covered. Does that sound like a plan? Because that's all I've got. So Ruth Haley Barton tells this beautiful story at the beginning of her book about looking at the sunset. And she says that she discovered, I've told this story before because it's powerful, and she just discovered that she began to notice that the sunset was the best bit of the day. And so she would begin to orientate her life around the sunset. She would move things so that she was always ready to watch the sunset. She lived in a place where there was a sunset every single day at a certain time, and so she lived by the sea, and I'm not at all jealous. And so she did this, and she noticed that everyone else did this same thing. There was a whole community of people who had come out onto the beach at a certain time. They're like turtles. They'd come out and just start gathering, and they'd all put their chairs out and maybe get a bottle of wine or a beer or an ice cream, and they'd watch the sunset. And she would do this. She began to become fixated with organizing her life around the sunset. And one day she found herself in a supermarket, and she suddenly realized that the sun was going down and she was missing that moment. So she dropped everything where she was. Hopefully she put the stuff back on the shelves. And then she walked to the beach and then sat still and watched the sunset. And she uses this metaphor as a way of saying, you know, we have a choice about how we orientate our lives, about what's important and what's not important. And I had begun to notice that there was one thing that was more important to me than other things, and that was the sunset going down, this beautiful feeling I got. And so she would orientate her life around it. And so she used that as a way of saying, wouldn't it be good if I orientated my life around Jesus in a way that I kind of regularly and routinely got his benefit in my life? And I wonder what would happen. So that's what she did, and really that's why she wrote the book called Sacred Rhythms. And when you think of rhythms, I don't know what you think of, but I often think of music. And you can almost hear the music coming out of the screen, can't you? You can feel the rhythm of this music. Maybe some drumming, obviously, is rhythmic. And there's something about being connected to other people in a rhythmic way that feels good, doesn't it? And then there's the rhythm of our internal world. I went cycling today. My camper van didn't work. That's not a rare thing, but it didn't switch on today, and so the battery had gone flat. And so I had to cycle to visit some people, and I noticed that my heart started beating very strongly after about 3 pedals, and it was interesting because obviously it's always doing that, but I suddenly felt it. You know, this rhythm that's inside us every single moment of every single day, and of course we're part of a much bigger rhythm outside of ourselves. And then maybe you think of the rhythm of dance. This is Tori and me, and I'm a real dad dancer, so I'm not that dancer. But I love the idea of being able to dance and being in rhythm with someone else. It's that moment of something where you're more than just yourself. You lose yourself into someone else, and you're in sync with someone else. Rhythm is a beautiful idea, isn't it? And it feels good when we're in rhythm. And I think these things come, connection, balance, and flow. They all are part of what it is to be in rhythm, in sync. My back is a bit sore at the moment. Anyone else's back a bit sore? Anyone else over 50, you know? And we're struggling with our backs. And I feel the thing about being out of sync. And I know that I need some exercises to get my back in sync, in line. And this is what I think we're looking at. So where should we start? Well, the wisdom of others is that we should start with desire. Ruth's not the only one to talk about this, but John Eldridge, I don't know if you've ever seen the book called Desire. Well, it's all about the power of desire and why we need to start our spiritual journey with desire. Desire is often seen as a negative thing in Christianity. It's often seen as the thing that pulls you away, and there are many reasons why that would be the case, because it does pull us away. Desires are often things that are very strong, powerful motivators for us. In fact, I think without desire, there is no motivation. So desire is a very important driver in our lives. But not all drivers are the same, but it's very important that we pay attention to our drivers. And if we have any desire, if we have any reason to be connected to God, it's going to come from a place of desire. So Ruth Haley Barton says, desire is the beginning of our spiritual journey. So we're going to need to think before we go anywhere further down the line of practices, because what happens is you hear about the thing called silence, or you think about prayer or fasting, and you get on with it and try and do it, but you haven't spent the time thinking about why you want to do any of that, or you haven't really thought about what's really going on inside you, and so you trip up, or you find it hard going, and prayer is a bit dry, or the fasting seems meaningless, and so you give up on your practice. Anyone done that? You've kind of worked your way into something. But really the first thing to do is to step backwards into a more reflective place where we wonder what's really going on inside our heart. And for this we need to have a bit of self-knowledge, but we also need friends. Because it's worth asking your friends. They might be able to tell you what it is that you desire and what it is you spend your time looking at. Or they may be able to help you ask some questions about your desires. They may be able to direct you in your exploration of what it is your desire. Because I've talked about this before, and I think a few of you said, I don't really know what I do desire. Which doesn't mean you don't desire anything. It just means you don't yet know what it is. You haven't really worked it out. Maybe a bit like Bono. And of course, why do we sing songs about desire? In fact, most of our songs are about desire, aren't they? That was another Bono song. Why do we sing songs about desire? Well, because that's our life. If you take desire out of life, there's not much left, is there? The heat from our lives, the goodness of our lives comes from desire. Have you watched the film Shawshank Redemption? Yeah, it's a great film, isn't it? It's one of those great all-time greats. Well, this is Red, and he says this. At first, these walls, you hate them. They make you crazy. After a while, you get used to them. Don't notice them anymore. Then comes the day when you realize you need them. What he's talking about is the loss of desire over time. To start with, I have desire to get out, desire to get free, and gradually the walls begin to take away your desire. And this is a metaphor for our lives, isn't it? That gradually, sometimes over time, the walls begin to tell us that we can't desire anymore, and our desire goes down. We used to have desire. Remember a time when we had desire. Oh, how we dreamed. And now we don't have desire anymore. Do you remember how we sang on the banks of the Babylon? Is that right? Is that a quote from Scripture, or have I made it up? I have no idea to this day what those two Italian ladies were singing about. Truth is, I don't want to know. Some things are better left unsaid. I'd like to think they were singing about something so beautiful it can't be expressed in words, and it makes your heart ache because of it. I tell you, those voices soared higher and further than anybody in a grey place dares to dream. It was as if some beautiful bird had flapped into our drab little cage and made these walls dissolve away. And for the briefest of moments, every last man in Shawshank felt free. It moves us, doesn't it? And it relates to our current worlds and our current feelings, that we often feel like we're caught up in a grey world, in a cage. And then some music comes along, something that breaks into our cage and makes our hearts dream again. And this feels scary and frightening, because desire is a powerful thing, but it might disappoint us once again. I want to read you a story from which John Eldridge, he narrates the story of blind Bartimaeus. You know this story. The shriveled figure lay in the sun like a pile of rags dumped there by accident. It hardly appeared to be human, but those who used the gates to go in and out of Jerusalem recognized him. He was disabled, dropped off every morning by someone in his family and picked up again at the end of the day. A rumor was going around that sometimes, no one really knew when, an angel would stir the waters and the first one in would be healed. Sort of a lottery, if you will. And as every lottery, the desperate gathered round, hoping for a miracle. It had been a long time since anyone had actually spoke to him. He thought the question was meant for someone else. Squinting upward into the sun, he didn't recognize the figure standing above him. The misshapen man asked the fellow to repeat himself. Perhaps he'd misheard. Although the voice was kind, the question felt harsh, even cruel. Do you want to get well? He sat speechless, blinking into the sun. Slowly the words seeped into his consciousness, like a voice calling out of a dream. Do I want to get well? Slowly, like a wheel long rusted, his mind began to turn over. What kind of question is that? Why else would I be lying here? Why else would I have spent every day for the past 38 seasons lying here? He is mocking me. But now that his vision had adjusted to the glare, he could see the inquisitor's face, his eyes. The face was as kind as the voice he heard. Apparently, the man meant what he said, and he was waiting for an answer. Do you want to get well? What is it that you want? It was Jesus who posed this question. So there must be something we're missing here. He was love incarnate. So why did he ask the paraplegic such an embarrassing question? Of course the fellow wanted to get well. Put yourself in the man's shoes, literally in his shoes. His entire life had been shaped by his brokenness. All his days he has wanted one thing. Forget riches, forget fame. Life for this man was captured in one simple, unreachable desire. When the older children ran and played, he sat and watched. When his family stood at the temple to pray, he lay on the ground. Every time he needed to have a drink or go to the bathroom, someone had to pick him up and take him there. So he had gone there for the past 38 years, hoping to hit the jackpot. Sure, it was a long shot, but it was all he had. At what point did he begin to lose hope? The first year? Then 2 went by. Nothing, at least for him. Maybe someone else got a miracle. What about 5 years with no results? 10? How long can we sustain desire against continuous disappointment? Some hold out for longer than others, but eventually we all move to a place of resignation or cynicism or bitterness. As the years rolled on, this man, like all of us, began to lose any vital heart connection to what he wanted. He was present, but not accounted for. The calluses had formed, not in the heart of Jesus, but over the man's heart. He had abandoned desire. Jesus took him back into the secret of his own heart by asking him what he wanted. Jesus took the man back into his desire. Why? It's where we must go if we are to meet God. The psalmist says, "As the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. Where can I go and meet with God?" O God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My body longs for you in a dry and weary land where there is no water. I wonder whether you relate to this story of desperation, or really a story of desperation that's turned into numbness, where you don't even really know what you want anymore. You can't even admit it to yourself. Brothers and sisters, we need, according to these wise people who write books, we need to rediscover our desire in order to find God. Everybody's got a hungry heart, says Bruce Springsteen. I won't sing that for you. So Ruth Haley Barton says this: the spiritual life begins with the willingness to name our desire in Jesus' presence. Let me read that again. The spiritual life begins with the willingness to name our desire in Jesus' presence. Do you remember when you first followed Jesus? Probably it came out of a situation where you knew that in your heart of hearts that Jesus was the answer to your deepest desire. There was something magnetic and attractive and powerful about Jesus himself that drew you towards him. Your desire for God and your capacity to reach out for more of God than you have right now is the deepest essence of who you are. It is one of the most powerful motivators for a life lived with intentionality and focus. In a few days' time, we'll have a woman known to many people across the world for her faith, her obedience, her joyfulness, her passion, Jackie Pullinger. And I think she's someone whose desire for God and her capacity to reach for more of God than she has right now is the deepest essence of who she is. Just recovering from illness, she travels hundreds of miles in order to come here. Why? Because she still wants more of God. It's a very powerful story. Even if we get nothing else, just her presence here will have an impact on us. She's someone who's frail, old, not so old, but you understand what I'm saying. Someone who reveals to us a heart that's still longing for more, still desiring more. This is a rare thing, even in churches. Meister Eckhart says this: the reason we do not see God is the faintness of our desire. And Ruth Haley Barton again says, you might think that your woundedness or your sinfulness is the truest thing about you. You might think that your giftedness or your personality type or your job title or your identity as husband or wife, mother or father, excuse my spelling mistakes, somehow defines you. But in reality, it is your desire for God and your capacity to reach for God that is the deepest essence of who you are. So we might reflect tonight as we go to bed, who am I? And you might have a question, how much do I desire God? And that will tell you something about who you are, which is a powerful question, isn't it? And it makes me wonder, and maybe we can chat about it with our friends. So the first thing we need to do is to understand our desire. And so I've been thinking, how do you help people to understand their desire when it seems complicated and not always easy to understand? And the first thing I came up with was pain. Our desire will often be revealed to us when we're facing a challenge of some kind. So we could narrate our life by looking at what's caused us the most pain. And as we peel back the story of pain, we'll discover what it is that was so hurtful, so bad, so awful about those situations. Because we notice that for some people, the same experience is not as painful as it is for others. Does that make sense? Two people, one person can have a limp and the other person have a limp. And for one person, this is terrible, and the other person, it's just a limp. But for one person, it's a deeply distressing thing. And behind that distress is a desire for something that's being thwarted. So maybe you want to narrate your story by looking through and looking for the pain. Because if you discover the pain, you might discover what it is that you're really looking for in life. And the other thing that you might look for is, when have you felt most alive? When have you felt most in flow? Because when your heart sings, that will also indicate to you what you truly long for. And again, you notice the difference between you and the person sitting next to you. The person sitting next to you doesn't get excited about the thing you get excited about. It doesn't matter to him or her as much as it matters to you. And so one of the things you might want to wonder about is what makes me really excited? What makes me feel? What makes me lose it completely? What makes me disappear and feel at one with the world? When do I feel alive? Pain and flow. Okay. So we have this problem. The first thing that happens is that we have a gap, which is a desire, and that's really your first task. In your small groups, if you go to a small group and you want to be part of a small group, then the first task you want to ask each other is, how do we help each other to discover our desires? And desires creates a gap between what is and what should be. And that creates a place of discomfort. And therefore, we have to try and work out, how do we close this gap? And one of the ways we close the gap is that we reduce our desires so that it doesn't feel so bad anymore. We reduce our hunger in some way. And the other is that we try and improve our life to try and get towards our desire. And that's a better way of trying to work things out, I would suggest. And we do this in many different ways. And you can see this in your workplace or in your family. You know, you just gather with a group of other people and you see them trying to reduce the gap between what they want to happen and where they currently are. And you just see them trying to reduce it in all sorts of ways. So that's why people go running in the morning, isn't it? They have an idea of themselves. So they have a desire to be fit and healthy. And so they think, well, running in the morning is going to be a thing that helps me to get there. Or they are ambitious about status or whatever it is. And so you find that they reduce this gap in numerous different ways. But for us as Christians, we discover that none of those things reduce the gap sufficiently. And we get to that point where we give up trying to reduce the gap in all sorts of worldly desires ways. So when Paul talks about the desires of the flesh, he's talking about all these different ways that we try and reduce the gap. And instead, he replaces that with the desire, a right desire for Jesus. And Jesus needs to be indispensable to us. This is the cry of the alcoholic who realizes that their life will not be solved by alcohol anymore. They are powerless over it, and they decide to give up everything in order to discover the one power that is able to help them. And this is our journey, and we need to find a way of rediscovering. Well, until Jesus is indispensable to us, and we can't get up in the morning without Jesus, well, then we're still living in the hinterland of life in all its fullness, aren't we? Until Jesus is everything to us, then we're still missing the mark. Not because we're sinning, but we're missing the presence of God in our lives. When we do without him in our daily work, the way we do our daily lives, if we do without him in our parenting, if we do without him in our finances, if we don't really need him for much of our lives, then we're missing out on his life. But the cry of the hungry heart is the one which goes, Jesus, I need you today. I need you to help me in my relationships. I need you to help me in my parenting. I need you to help me in every aspect of my life. Then after we've made that first move towards Jesus and said he's our center point, we then need the courage to follow him. And do you remember the stories of Abraham? He needed courage, didn't he? And the first story of Abraham is the story of him leaving his home. Or Moses, what about Moses? He would be another man who needed courage, and he didn't have the courage to start with. And Jesus and the Father needed to help him with his courage. He needed to remind him that God would put words in his mouth. It would be okay, Moses, take courage. Or Joshua, the guy who followed Moses, he didn't have courage. And so God repeated how many times? 3 times. Have great courage. And so on and so forth, all the way through Scripture. David, what about David? Well, David actually showed quite good courage, didn't he? Remember the David and Goliath story? And he decided that he wouldn't put on the king's armor, but he would stand in his own skin. He would stand in his own clothes before Goliath. And this is what marked David out from all the others, because he had courage. Or think of Mary, the mother of Jesus. I am who I am, but if it's your will to use me, then use me. That took great courage. If you want to put your life within me, then use me. And so these people had desires, but they then needed to step into the desire with some courage. And maybe that's part of where our gap is at the moment. We need to have an increase of courage or faith. But after faith comes some kind of, Jordan Sen called it consecration, but maybe a better word is surrender. We need to let go of stuff. We need to relax into this place of trust. And Jesus talked about repentance all the time. This is a really important word for him. Have faith and repent and believe was the way that Jesus put it. And this may be, again, where we're struggling at the moment. We haven't quite surrendered because we don't believe that Jesus is really indispensable for our lives. No, we can find all sorts of other ways of closing the gap. So we continue to travel along our own way. But then we get to a point where we realize that we don't have the resources in us, or these other things are not going to, and then we surrender, and eventually we surrender. And this is a good thing. This is the beginning of our lives. But then after surrender comes the routine. And this is what leads us into a series called Sacred Rhythms. Because it's not enough just to step into Jesus to say, I give you everything, and stand there. Because actually then we need a way of living. We need a way of staying in step with him. We need a way of being in sync with him on an ongoing basis. So these are the disciplines and practices of obedience. Dallas Willard, you remember him? I talked about him many times. He says we need VIM, vision, intention, and means. We need vision for a life, and then we need to decide something, and then we need a means of doing it. We need a way of doing it. Some resources that I'm going to tell you about over the course. I'm going to when you get the written bits of paper, and I'll put it on the website as well. You'll see that there's a whole lot of books that you might want to read. Here's a few. So Desire by John Eldridge, Invitation to Silence and Solitude, Sacred Rhythms by Ruth Haley Barton. And here's one for those who are maybe in the second half of life, a book called Sacred Fire, A Vision for Deeper Human and Christian Maturity by a guy called Ronald Rolheiser. A really good book for anyone who is my age or older. You'll also find some other. You're smiling at yourselves, aren't you? Trying to work out how old that is. What I want you to do now, before we go on to talk a little bit more about silence and solitude, is just talk to the person sitting next to you, or maybe in threes, about desire. And just wonder to yourselves about desire. Is there anything about desire that, the way I've talked about it, that resonates with you? Is there any problem you've got? Do you know what desire is? Do you know what your deepest desire is? If you want to share something very deep, you can. If you want to just talk superficial, that's fine too. So just give yourself a few minutes just to share your desires with one another or talk about it. Very good. Well, whilst you're choosing your sweets and wondering which you desire the most, we're going to finish this evening by looking at a primary discipline. In fact, the spiritual heroes and writers of the last 2,000 years would let us know that silence and solitude is the primary discipline. And this is news to me. It was never something that I was particularly taught as a child, although my parents often told me to be quiet, but it wasn't. They weren't trying to develop in me a discipline of silence and solitude. Although I did see my father on a regular basis going off to his study, closing the door and reading his Bible. I discovered the other day that anyone used Bible reading notes, daily Bible reading notes. He used Scripture Union. I think it's called Daily Bread. Anyone use that? Yeah, quite a few of it. Okay, so, well, my dad's been using that for the last, I don't know how many, 40 years, 50 years. And he had one of those Bibles with a big margin down the side. A floppy, big Bible, and he told me just last week that he would read through that, whatever it was. He always says to me excitedly, we're in Numbers at the moment, it's great. Like he's excited about it, it's really good. We're in Nehemiah, what a great story. And he was saying he would make a note in the margin of what the date of the notes were. So like it was June 2020 or whatever, write that in the margin. And then when he was reading so he's done that for the last 40 years in the side of his Bible. And then when he was reading his Bible and not sure and leading a Bible study or something, he would think, I don't know what this passage means, or I need some inspiration. He'd look up, he would then file his daily reading notes, which he's got, all of them for the last 40 years. He'd find the right. That's amazing, isn't it? He hasn't missed a day, I think. I mean, if he has missed a day, he's caught it up. So I lived in an environment where discipline was part of the culture, and yet silence and solitude wasn't talked about so much. Anyone familiar with that? We had Bible study, and we had this thing called quiet time. Did you have that? Yeah. I found quiet time quite difficult as a child, and it's something that maybe as an adult I never really mastered, and it's something that I'm really trying to work on, because I think I've become convinced that it is Jesus' number one discipline. So there are two kinds. You notice that there are two words, silence and solitude. Silence is letting go of our inner distractions. Anyone know what we mean by inner distractions? It's always there, isn't it? The kind of inner tape of our minds. Silence is where we begin to let go of those things, because in silence they will reveal themselves very quickly, won't they? You sit in silence for long enough and they all start appearing. The inner world becomes very evident to us. Solitude is where we let go of our outer distractions. And this is because we're used to being in an environment where we're constantly with other people. And before the internet, we had people to be distracting, and now we just have the internet. But we have constant distractions all the time. And solitude is where we remove ourselves completely from other people's distractions, which includes the internet now. And we have to be very determined to leave our mobile phones away so that we can be without distraction. And again, what that reveals to us is something that goes on inside our hearts. And eventually we will be able to find God. So here are just a few times when Jesus, I say a few times because there'll be more verses in the next 5 minutes than you really want. Believe me. At once the Spirit sent Jesus out into the desert, or the lonely place where he was, and he was in the desert for 40 days being tempted by Satan. The Spirit leads him to the wilderness, and he was with the wild animals, and the angels attended him. Mark 1:16, Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee. Come, follow me. He walked beside the Sea of Galilee. Has anyone done any walking along the Sea of Galilee? I'm going to do that in October. Looking forward to that. But, remember walking, where we just went walking by the sea. It's a quiet place, isn't it? Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed, Mark 1:35. Everyone was looking for Jesus, but after his time in prayer, he told his disciples that it was time for them to move on to another village. Despite Jesus' plea that his miracles be kept silent or secret, the news about him spread all the more, so that crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places. The words desert and solitary place and lonely place, they're all the same word, eremos. It's the same word. Jesus spent a lot of time in lonely places. He often withdrew to lonely places and pray. Once again, Jesus went out beside the lake, Mark 2:13. On Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields with his disciples, and his disciples walked along. I think the walking thing is important for me because it's a place, it may be a place of conversation, but walking takes time, doesn't it? Have you been for a long walk? After a while, the conversation dies down and you just walk. Jesus did a lot of walking. He had distances to travel and he walked. It gives you time to think. And Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the lake, and a large crowd from Galilee followed. Mark 3. Jesus went onto a mountainside to pray, and he spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him. Mark 3. Jesus went out of the house and sat by the lake. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat in it while all the people stood on the shore, and then he told them many things in parables. When Jesus heard that John the Baptist had been beheaded, which was an incredibly traumatic experience for him, his cousin was killed in the most grotesque way, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. How do we deal with crises? What do we do when everything falls apart, where our world view is shattered? Well, Jesus had a habit of withdrawing to solitary places. Because so many people were coming and going, they did not even have a chance to eat. So Jesus said to his disciples, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went away with him. After Jesus had dismissed the crowds, he went up onto the mountainside by himself to pray. Mark 6. When evening came, he was still there alone. You see what happens? I'm only on slide 2. I've got another few more slides. And this is just Mark chapter 6. Jesus entered a house and did not want anyone to know it, yet he could not keep the present secret. Once when Jesus was praying in private and his disciples were with him, he asked them, "Who do the crowds say am I?" You see, he's praying in private. Jesus went on from there and walked beside the Sea of Galilee, and he went up onto a mountain and sat down there on a mountain. Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up to a high mountain, and they were all alone. It seems like it was just part and parcel of Jesus' life to be on his own, to withdraw. He did the face-to-face stuff. Oh, yes, he did that, but he often withdrew. After his brothers had gone up to the feast, then Jesus also went up, not publicly, but in private. One day Jesus was praying, I can't remember what that, in a certain place. In a certain place. It's interesting, the gospel writers talk about it like the deserted place had become a certain place. It's like the place he always goes to. One more slide. Again, the religious leaders in Jerusalem sought to arrest Jesus, but he escaped from their hands. He went away again, walking about 5 miles across the Jordan to the place where John had been baptizing at first. So you can see the threat is building. This is near the end of the story, John 10, as they're beginning to want to arrest him, and he withdraws to be on his own with his Father. They're on their way to Jerusalem, but with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished while those who followed were afraid. Mark 10. Apparently Jesus kept silent for most of the 22-mile hike. Luke says that Jesus was resolute. He told them that he'd be tortured and killed in Jerusalem. When Jesus had sung a hymn and his disciples had sung a hymn, they went out onto the Mount of Olives, which is his favorite place to go and pray. It's his usual place to go and pray when he was in Jerusalem. And they went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." The last verse that is on this screen says, "They crucified Jesus. Darkness came over the whole land. Jesus called out with a loud voice, 'Father, into your hands I commit my spirit.'" His story ends in silence. It's a place he was very familiar with. He wasn't daunted by it or frightened by it. It was his home. It was the place where he found God. And this teaches me something, and it's something that I'm struggling with, and I want it to change. Ruth Haley Barton says, "Solitude is the time when we pull away from our life in the company of others, which is where we spend most of our life, in order to give our full and undivided attention to God. Silence deepens the experience of solitude." Solitude is one thing, silence deepens it. In silence, we withdraw not only from the outer noise, but also from inner noise of our thoughts, human strivings, intellectual hard work, and inner compulsions, so that we can listen to God. One of the things I find myself doing when I'm silent, I don't know whether you do this, when you're trying to be with God, is then writing a plan of action. Have you ever done that? You start brainstorming your life, how to make it better. Have you done this? You kind of sit on your own, I'm going to be with God for a moment, and you start mapping out your story and trying to make things better, making lists of things. Have you done this? Writing lists. It's quite hard work, writing lists and organizing your life, and it's not silence and solitude. It's not being with God. It's sorting your life out. It's a good thing to do, but it's not being with God, is it? Have you been in a relationship with someone and you're sitting opposite them across the table, and they're writing a recipe or writing a list of things that they need to get? They're not with you at the time, are they? They're somewhere else. They're reading through what to watch on TV over Christmas. They're in the room with you, but they're not with you, are they? They're in the book. They're in the magazine. When we're with God, it means to be with God, and I've replaced being with God with being with my own thoughts and trying to work my own thoughts out, which is not the same. You understand what I'm saying? So it's not just being quiet, or being quiet is good, and writing lists is a good thing, but it's about being with God. It's about putting away my effort to think things through for a while, to try and stop thinking. The longing for solitude is the longing for God. It is the longing to experience union with God, unmediated by the ways we typically try to relate to God. It's the practice that spiritual seekers down through the ages have used to experience intimacy with God rather than just talking about it. That makes me smile. For someone who does a lot of talking about it, that makes me smile. Henry Nouwen, do you know him? A really wonderful, humble guy. A priest, a single guy, lived on his own, but then lived in community with others, the most physically disabled people, and lived in community with them in a community called the L'Arche community. He was a priest, and he spent a lot of time on his own, and he said this: without solitude, it's virtually impossible to have a spiritual life. I wonder how many churches have people with spiritual lives. Jesus said this: when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. That's what you should do when you pray. Close the door and pray to him who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. We want the spiritual life. We want to be alive. We want to be powerful. We want to be useful. We want to be alive. We want to be in flow. This is what Jesus recommends that we do. What are the goals of silence and solitude? The first thing might be intimacy or union with God, or what Jesus calls abiding with God. The second might be clarity and vision. And this we see in Jesus many times. We see both the sense of him being connected with his Father, but then we see him getting an idea about something. Now it's time to move on, or these are my disciples that I want you to choose. He chooses the 12 after a period of silence. Now's the time to go up to Jerusalem. He does that after a period of silence. So you can get clarity and vision after a period of silence, whereas in fact the opposite is what we normally do, isn't it? It's what I do. I go and talk to people. What should I do? And I gather as many people around me to discuss what I should do, rather than withdraw and go to God and spend time until God speaks. And then the other thing that happens is that it might help us to know ourselves and also to know God better. The truth is that I don't know myself very well. I think I know myself, but because I don't listen to myself very much, I don't listen to the thoughts that are going on inside me or the feelings that I'm feeling, I don't admit them. I was trying silence the other day and I didn't like it. Not because of the lack of noise or conversation, but because I didn't like the emotion that was rising up in me. I had one of those thoughts when I started thinking about my family. Do you have that when you sit in silence, you find yourself thinking about your family? And inevitably, because all families are like this, there's a brokenness of a relationship somewhere in there, and that started raising its head. And I felt uncomfortable, and I didn't want to think about my family. I didn't want to think about this broken relationship. So what would you do in that situation? Well, I did what you would do, which is to break my silence. In fact, I broke my silence by picking up my mobile phone, which is why it's always good not to have your mobile phone anywhere near when you're in silence, because it's so tempting, isn't it? Particularly when the ashes are on. So what kind of stuff might rise up? I thank Charles for blowing this up for me. Thank you, Charles. But have you ever tried this when you're in a swimming pool? The fun of pushing it down in the water and seeing how long you can hold it under and then letting it go and it jumps up and everyone has a fun. It's a simple game. It's not very complicated. But it makes us happy, doesn't it? Kind of like holding it under the water and poof, off it comes. And then, poof, it's great. See, there's an inevitability about this thing. You cannot hold it down forever. At some point, you're going to let go and it's going to go woof. So what we see, we try and live life holding all these things down, don't we? It's like we're constantly trying to hold all these things together and we're pushing them down against the force of gravity or force of whatever else it is. What is the force? I don't know. That's beyond my scientific ability. So what might come up? Well, I've listed a whole number of things. Regret. Let's just stop there for a moment. Regret. Yep, I can understand that. Regret would come up. Sin. That's probably linked to regret, isn't it? Guilt. Well, that's connected to sin and regret, isn't it? And it doesn't take long for the shame to come. Guilt is the feeling I've done something wrong. Shame is the thing which comes and says, I am wrong. I'm no good. And that often you sit in silence. Sometimes you think, I'm just lousy. Have you ever had that feeling? So you get yourself active again. Go meet someone, have a coffee, do anything but sit in silence because you just feel lousy about yourself. I just wasted my life. I'm overweight. I've broken relationships. I've made mistakes. My finances are a mess. I can't think straight. I'm addicted to coffee. Everything. You just find numerous reasons to feel lousy about yourself. Shame, and which leads to worthlessness, which then is kind of like low status. Or we think about status. How many of you, when you sit in silence, you find yourself comparing yourself with other people? You just suddenly find yourself kind of thinking other people have got a better life than you. It doesn't take long, does it? And then that leads you to thinking about your role and how good your role is, or rather how inadequate your role is. It always feels like that. And then that leads into oughts and shoulds, because as soon as you start thinking about your role, you start thinking about, oh, I should be doing this and I ought to be doing this, and suddenly your responsibilities start emerging. Anyone sat in silence and found that happening? Which then leads you to question your purpose and your meaning. And then sometimes you can feel very alone in your silence. You sit there and alone, you just think, I have nobody, I'm Billy No Mates. I just have nobody. And the silence is horrible, and you feel very isolated, which links to your feelings about relationships, and you find yourself thinking about them, and that's not comfortable. And then I go through these a bit quicker. Look at this one, hurt. I mean, relationships linked to hurt, and then you realize you've got woundedness, and then that leads to maybe thinking about envious thoughts about other people, and or your failure, and then disappointment, and then fear might creep in, and then death. Death, you might have a fear thinking about death, yours or someone else's, and then which anxiety, and then that leads to thoughts of escape, wanting to leave things behind, wanting to get rid of things, wanting to clean the house, or maybe leave a relationship, or leave the area, or find a new job. You just want to run away, you want to hide away, you have a holiday idea that suddenly appears out of nowhere. And then there's the word lust that I've put on there, and then desire at the bottom. Now, can you see how these kind of tumble into each other? I didn't design, when I wrote them out, I didn't read this from a book. I just started thinking about the things that I think about. So that's an insight into what I think about when I'm sitting silent. So I'm a happy man, aren't I? You can see. You really want to become like me, don't you? That's just... But can you see that all these things, these are just human things, aren't they? And they're all in all of us in some way or other. And we're like trying to keep these things down, but they need to come up. But can you see how they end up in some way with desire? There's a longing inside my heart for something. There's a gap between what is and what should be. And until I've sat quietly enough, the murky water won't settle. There are a number of things that happen when you sit in silence. One is that thoughts go past. And they can be like clouds, or they can be like boats. Have you ever looked at the clouds? They're nice things to look at, and you can let them go past. You don't feel any responsibility for them, do you? Oh, there's a cloud. Not one of you ever thought, I want to go into that cloud and live on that cloud. That is the good way of thinking about when you're in silence, these thoughts that happen, they're like clouds. Just let them go. Notice them, sometimes admire them, sometimes think they're a bit grey, but just let them go. Or maybe they're like a boat that you can see in the distance. Well, you don't have to get on it, you just notice it, it's there. And you may have a whole flotilla of boats going past. You may just have one main one, a cruise ship. But you let them go. You let them go past. I'm coming to the end, and we're going to sing a song in a moment. The benefits of silence and solitude. Being away versus being available to others. We need to be away, I think. Switching off versus being connected or stimulated. Being in the present versus feeling driven. Feeling rested versus feeling exhausted. Feeling safe versus needing protection. Feeling open versus feeling insecure. Feeling surrendered versus feeling anxious. I'll take this side of the screen. So brothers and sisters, what are we going to do this week? Well, can I suggest that we try some silence? Here are a few things to try. You might want to read the Bartimaeus story and imagine yourself into it on your own, or maybe with a group in quiet, in silence. Imagine yourself in the Bartimaeus story. Or you might want to take Elijah's story, the guy who went into the wilderness for a while. You might want to take that story. You might want to leave your phone downstairs overnight. That's one of the things I've suggested before. Fasting from our phones is probably a number one spiritual discipline nowadays. You might want to have a 10-minute silence or solitude. Give yourself a small target, 10 minutes. Let's see if we can try silence for 10 minutes. Just see what happens. See if you can build it up over time, but let's just start with 10 minutes. You're going to have to choose a time to do it, otherwise you forget to do it. You might want to find a special seat or place to do the silence in. This is recommended by a friend, and they said choose a space. And every time you sit in that space, that's your silent seat. Don't do anything other than just sit in it. You can choose a chair. It's the chair you don't normally sit in, but just choose it as a silent seat. I thought that was a good idea. You might want to journal. And I've put a bracket around this because I think journaling is not always helpful. It's maybe a way into deeper silence, but as a way of starting, it might be helpful just to start journaling, just to get it all out. But it'd be good if we ended up without needing to write stuff down. We could just be with God. But as a good starting place, it's good, maybe good to journal. You might want to do a Bible study with a few others, Discovery Bible Study. I'll send some notes around and you can do that in a small group. And I recommend that you read Mark 10:46 to 52, which is the Bartimaeus story. In your life groups, you might also want to talk, what did I learn today? What did I understand? What do I want to change? Or what didn't I understand? And then make some decisions about what you're going to do. Let's be quiet for a moment. I'm going to ask Alan. Let's just be still for a moment.